You know that moment when you're standing in the sauce aisle at Woolies or Kohl's, reaching for your usual bottle, thinking you're making a decent choice for your family? What if I told you that some of the most trusted sauce brands sitting in Australian pantries right now aren't quite what they seem? In fact, 8 of them contain ingredients that might make you think twice before your next shop. But here's the thing that really caught my attention. It's not just about what's in them, it's about what we've been led to believe about them. And once you see what I found, you'll understand why this matters more than you might think. Look, I'm not here to panic anyone or claim I'm some sort of expert. I'm just an everyday Australian who started paying closer attention to what my family eats. Started reading labels properly, not just glancing at them. And what I discovered in that simple act of actually looking changed how I shop entirely. Because here's what nobody really talks about. We trust certain brands because they've been around forever, because they're on every shelf, because our parents bought them. But trust and transparency aren't always the same thing, are they? So I did something simple. I went to my local supermarket with a mission. Read every label on the sauce bottles I usually grab without thinking. Tomato sauce, barbecue sauce, soy sauce, the works. The stuff we use almost daily in Australian households. And what I found wasn't some dramatic conspiracy or scary food science. It was just information sitting right there on the back of the bottle that most of us never actually read. The kind of information that makes you pause and reconsider what you're actually buying. Let me start with something that surprised me most. You know those premium-looking sauce bottles with the fancy labels that cost a bit more? The ones that use words like traditional or authentic or classic recipe? I always assumed the higher price meant better ingredients, right? That's what we're supposed to think. But when I started comparing labels between a $15 bottle and a $5 bottle, something interesting emerged. Sometimes the cheaper one actually had a simpler ingredient list. Less additives. More recognizable ingredients. The expensive one was banking on packaging and marketing, not necessarily quality. Here's where it gets interesting, though. One of Australia's most popular tomato sauce brands, and I'm talking about one that's been in Australian kitchens for generations, contains more sugar per serve than you'd find in some soft drinks. 17 grams of sugar in just 2 tablespoons. Think about how much sauce you actually use on your snag at a weekend barbie. Most people use way more than 2 tablespoons, don't they? So you're potentially getting close to the same sugar hit as drinking a can of Coke, but you're thinking you're just having sauce on your sausage sandwich. Nobody's putting that together in their head when they're squeezing it onto their plate. And before you think, well, I'll just switch to the reduced sugar version. Let me tell you what I found there. The reduced sugar versions of several major brands replace that sugar with artificial sweeteners and thickeners to maintain the texture and taste. Sometimes 3 or 4 different types of thickeners. Now, are those necessarily dangerous? That's not for me to say. But it made me wonder, if I'm trying to reduce sugar, do I want to replace it with a cocktail of additives I can barely pronounce? Or would I be better off just using less of the regular version, or finding a brand with naturally lower sugar content? Then there's the whole no artificial colors claim you see plastered across certain bottles. Sounds great, right? Natural is better, we all think that. Except when you flip the bottle around and read the actual ingredients, you find colors like 150 and 160. These are food colorings. They're approved. They're legal. They're on shelves everywhere. But the label out front says no artificial colors, because technically these particular ones are classified differently. It's not lying, exactly. It's just selective truth-telling. The kind that relies on us not reading the fine print. Here's something that really got me thinking about how we shop. There's a barbecue sauce brand that's everywhere in Australia. You've definitely seen it, probably bought it. The front of the bottle has this rustic, homemade look. Makes you think of backyard barbecues and traditional Australian cooking. The ingredient list tells a different story, though. High fructose corn syrup is the second ingredient. Then there's caramel color, sodium benzoate, and about 6 different thickening agents. Nothing about that screams homemade, does it? But that packaging, that branding, it works. It makes us feel like we're buying something wholesome and Australian when we're actually buying a highly processed product that probably looks nothing like what someone's great-grandmother would have made in her kitchen. Now, let's talk about soy sauce for a minute, because this one genuinely surprised me. A lot of Australians use soy sauce regularly. Stir-fries, marinades, fried rice. It's in so many home kitchens. I always thought soy sauce was pretty straightforward. Soybeans, wheat, salt, water, right? That's the traditional Japanese or Chinese method anyway. But several brands commonly sold in Australian supermarkets contain hydrolyzed vegetable protein instead of traditionally brewed soy. This is a much faster, cheaper manufacturing process, takes days instead of months, and while it creates something that tastes vaguely like soy sauce, it's chemically quite different from the traditional product. What really matters here is that some of these quick-processed soy sauces can contain much higher levels of sodium than traditionally brewed versions. We're talking 1,200 milligrams of sodium in just 1 tablespoon for some brands. The Australian Dietary Guidelines recommend adults consume no more than 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day total. 1 tablespoon of sauce, and you're already over halfway there. But the bottle doesn't make that clear, does it? It just sits there on the shelf looking like every other soy sauce bottle, and we assume they're all basically the same. Here's where I need to be really clear about something. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not trying to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't eat. What I am trying to do is share what I found when I started actually reading labels, because I think most Australians would want to know this stuff. We deserve to know what we're buying and feeding our families, don't we? And the thing is, this information isn't hidden. It's right there on every bottle. We just don't look. We trust the brand. We trust the marketing. We grab and go. But something shifted in my mind when I started comparing brands side by side. There's a pasta sauce brand that markets itself as being made from real tomatoes and having no added nasties. Sounds brilliant, yeah? Except the ingredient list includes sugar, then more sugar in the form of glucose, then thickener 440, and preservative 202. Now, are these ingredients dangerous? Probably not in the amounts we consume them. They're approved for use in Australia. But when a label out front says no added nasties, and the back label reads like a chemistry experiment, there's a disconnect there. And that disconnect made me realize how much we rely on the marketing on the front of the package, rather than the facts on the back. There's another sauce brand, really popular in Australian households, especially for Asian cooking, that contains monosodium glutamate as its third ingredient. Now, MSG is legal, it's approved, and most research suggests it's safe for most people in normal amounts. I'm not here to debate MSG. What caught my attention was how the packaging emphasizes being authentic and traditional. But MSG isn't part of traditional preparation methods for most Asian sauces. It's a modern additive used to enhance flavor quickly and cheaply. Again, not necessarily wrong, but it's worth knowing what you're actually getting versus what the marketing suggests you're getting, isn't it? Let me tell you about what happened when I started looking at the healthy alternatives. You know, the ones in the health food section or the organic brands that cost significantly more. I wanted to see if the extra money was buying me anything real or just buying me clever marketing. And honestly, it was a mixed bag. Some of the expensive organic brands had genuinely simpler ingredient lists, just tomatoes, vinegar, salt, spices, the kind of ingredients you could actually make sauce from in your own kitchen if you had the time. But others, despite the premium pricing and the organic labels, still contained added sugars, thickeners, and preservatives. They were just organic versions of those additives, which made me wonder, am I paying extra for actually better ingredients? Or am I paying extra for the feeling of making a better choice? Here's what really struck me, though. Once I started reading labels consistently, I noticed patterns across different sauce brands owned by the same parent companies. Different bottles, different branding, different price points, but remarkably similar ingredient lists. Sometimes the only difference was the order of ingredients or 1 or 2 additives swapped out. But we see them as completely different products because of how they're packaged and marketed to us. One's positioned as premium, One's positioned as budget-friendly, one's positioned as healthy, but underneath all that marketing, they're far more similar than we'd guess just by looking at the shelf. And this brings me to something I think is worth considering. These companies aren't doing anything illegal. They're following Australian food standards. They're disclosing ingredients on their labels. But they're also incredibly smart about how they market these products to us. They know most people won't read the back label. They know we make decisions based on brand recognition, packaging design, price point, and the claims on the front of the bottle. They're counting on us not doing what I did, actually reading and comparing. And honestly, it works brilliantly. We're all busy. We're all trying to get through the shops quickly. And reading every label on every product takes time we often don't have. But here's what I learned from doing this exercise. Once you read labels carefully, for even a few shopping trips, you start to remember which brands actually align with what you want to buy. It stops being time-consuming because you've already done the research. You know which brands have simple ingredients and which ones don't. You know which ones have high sugar content and which ones have naturally lower amounts. You develop a kind of mental shortlist, and shopping actually becomes faster, not slower, because you're not standing there wondering if you're making a good choice or not. You already know. There's a chutney brand that's everywhere in Australia. Beautiful packaging, premium pricing, lovely story about traditional recipes on their website. When I checked the label, the second ingredient after tomatoes was sugar. Not just sugar, but a lot of it. 23 grams per serving. And you know what else I found? The serving size they list on the nutritional panel is 1 tablespoon. Who uses 1 tablespoon of chutney? Most people use at least 3 or 4 tablespoons with a cheese platter or a curry. So you're potentially consuming close to 100 grams of sugar from what you thought was just a nice condiment. Again, not the end of the world if you're aware of it and making that choice consciously. But if you think you're just having a bit of chutney and not realizing it's delivering that much sugar, that's a different situation entirely, isn't it? Now, here's where this gets really interesting from a consumer perspective. Australian food labeling laws require companies to list ingredients in descending order by weight. That's helpful, and it's why I could see that sugar was often the second or third ingredient in many sauces. But there's no requirement to highlight how much of certain ingredients are in the product. So a sauce could be 30% sugar, and as long as it's listed in order, that's compliant. We have to look at the nutritional information panel separately and do our own calculations to figure out the actual proportions. Most people don't do that. Most people, including me before I started paying attention, just assumed that if something was sold as a sauce, the main ingredient would be whatever the sauce is supposed to be made from. Tomato sauce should be mostly tomatoes, right? Except often it's mostly sugar, and tomatoes are just part of the mix. There's a brand of oyster sauce sold widely in Australian Asian grocery sections that, when I read the label, contained no oysters at all. It was made from mushroom extract, soy sauce, sugar, and thickeners. Now, there's nothing wrong with mushroom-based sauce. But calling it oyster sauce when there are no oysters feels a bit misleading, doesn't it? Especially when traditional oyster sauce is made from, well, oysters. This one even had a picture of oysters on the label, but buried in the fine print was something like oyster-flavored sauce, rather than actual oyster sauce. It's technically accurate, but it relies on us not reading carefully enough to notice the difference. What I've realized through all this is that being an informed consumer in Australia requires actual effort. The information is available, which is good. Australian food standards are actually quite rigorous compared to many countries, which is also good. But the gap between what's marketed to us and what's actually in the bottle can be significant. And that gap exists because it's profitable. If we all read labels carefully and bought accordingly, companies would likely change their formulations. But most people don't, so there's no incentive for them to change. We're essentially voting with our wallets, except we're voting without actually knowing what we're voting for. Here's my point with all of this. I'm not telling you to throw out everything in your pantry. I'm not saying these sauce brands are dangerous, or that you should never buy them. What I am saying is that it's worth taking 10 minutes on your next shop to actually read the labels of the sauces you regularly buy. Compare them. See what's actually in there, Because once you know, you can make informed choices. Maybe you decide you don't care about the sugar content, and that's completely fine. Or maybe you decide you want to find a brand with simpler ingredients. Or you want to make your own sauce at home. Whatever choice you make, at least it's an informed one, rather than a choice based on clever packaging and brand loyalty. The 8 brands I'm talking about, and I'm being deliberately vague here because this isn't about shaming specific companies. They're all legal, all approved for sale in Australia, all following the rules. But they all have something in common. They have significant gaps between what their marketing suggests and what their ingredient lists reveal. High sugar content masked by health claims. Multiple additives in products marketed as natural. Quick process manufacturing for products marketed as traditional. Simplified serving sizes that hide actual nutritional impact. It's not any one thing that's the issue. It's the cumulative effect of all these small gaps between perception and reality. What really changed my perspective was realizing how much power we actually have as consumers. Every time we choose one product over another, we're sending a signal about what matters to us. If enough Australians started choosing sauces with simpler ingredients, lower sugar content, and more transparent labeling, companies would respond. They respond to market demand, because that's how they make money. But we can't send clear signals if we don't know what we're actually buying in the first place, can we? And here's the thing that keeps coming back to me. This isn't just about sauces. It's about how we engage with everything we buy and consume. Sauces were just my starting point, because they're in every Australian household, and we use them without thinking much about them. But the same principles apply to breakfast cereals, snack foods, drinks, ready meals, everything. Once you start reading labels in one category, you naturally start reading them in others. And that awareness, that's actually empowering. You stop feeling like you're just accepting whatever companies decide to sell you, and you start feeling like you're making conscious choices about what comes into your home and what your family eats. So, here's what I'd suggest. Next time you're at Woolies, Coles, or wherever you shop, before you grab your usual sauce bottle, just flip it around. Read the ingredient list, look at the nutritional panel, see how much sugar is in a serving, and then think about how much you actually use. Check if the serving size is realistic. Look at the order of ingredients. You might be surprised. You might decide it doesn't matter to you. Or you might decide to try a different brand. Whatever you decide, you'll be deciding from knowledge rather than assumption. Because that's what this is really about. Having enough information to make choices that align with what matters to us. Whether that's health, taste, price, or convenience. We can't make those choices meaningfully if we're relying on marketing alone. And I think most Australians, if they knew what was actually in some of these products versus what the packaging suggests, would want the option to choose differently. The sauce aisle isn't going to change overnight. These brands will still be there, still be popular, still be part of Australian kitchens. But maybe if more of us start paying attention, start reading labels, start asking questions, maybe that creates momentum for positive changes. Better labeling, simpler ingredients, more transparency. Not because companies suddenly become altruistic, but because we demand it with our choices. And that's what I wanted to share. Not a scare story, not an attack on brands, just information. The kind sitting right there on the shelf all along, waiting for someone to notice. Now you know what I found. What you do with it is up to you. But at least now you have it.